So around here, we'd like to use something called a preaching calendar. And basically what a preaching calendar does is it allows us to be intentional and strategic about what we're saying and when we're saying it throughout the year. But every once in a while, something happens that causes us to press pause on the calendar and address what's right in front of us. That happened once with COVID-19. And basically the life change was so dramatic with that, we basically just ditched the calendar and had to start from scratch. But we stopped to address the uncertainty and the anxiety that so many of us were and frankly still are dealing with. And now we're doing that again. We had a plan for this week, but we've pressed pause on the new calendar to address the issue that's in front of all of us right now. It's the issue of racial injustice. And this has been a problem for a long time, but recently has taken center stage because of the murders of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, and of Ahmaud Arbery. Now, before we jump into it, there's a few things that I feel like I need to say and some things that I'm going to ask you to understand. First is that this is a really tough topic to talk about. In 7 years, I don't think I've ever had such a difficult time figuring out what to say. And the reason why is because this is so deeply emotional for so many different people. We put out something on Facebook and Instagram not too long ago, and a lot of people were in support of what we said, but a lot of people were not. And what was eye-opening to me was the different reasons that people gave for not supporting it. The reasons were across the board, and it helped me to see how complex the emotions are when it comes to racial injustice. The other thing I want you to know is that my understanding of all of this is severely limited by my own experience. I don't know what it's like to be a law enforcement officer. I also have no idea what it's like to be a person of color. And the further along I get in this process, the more I realize I don't know. You've heard me say before, I don't even know what I don't know. And that's becoming more and more and more and more obvious to me. And so while I'm sharing with you today, there may be some things that come off as insensitive and frankly just reveal the level of my ignorance. And first of all, I would ask your forgiveness right now for that. Secondly, I can promise you I'm not trying to be insensitive by anything that I say. And third, I'm not proud of my ignorance. It's something that I'm working to fix. But I feel like this issue is too important for us to just unaddress because we're afraid of not phrasing things the right way or of saying the wrong thing. And so I also think it's important for you to understand that today I'm going to be sharing with you mostly about the issues of racism that I have been unaware of. And in explaining a lot of this, you might feel like I'm anti-law enforcement or that I'm in some way minimizing the sacrifice that so many have made to protect and serve our communities. And that's not what I'm doing. I also want you to know that my best friend is my little brother, and he's a member of the Secret Service. He is in the heart of Washington, D.C. He's in the Uniform Division, and he is in the middle of the protests every single day. Some peaceful and some not peaceful. And so all of this, I'm sharing with you to let you know that my perspective is very limited, but this is too important of an issue to just breeze over or to not address at all. Really, when it comes to addressing this, the thing that I feel like I am most equipped to talk to you about is my own personal journey in trying to understand the issue of racial injustice. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to share with you what things have been like for me. In light of the fact that I'm a white male who has grown up in a white family and a predominantly white community, there is so much that I just haven't been exposed to. And so the words that have served really as like my marching orders have been the words of Jesus' brother. His name was James. We've talked about him before. But there's a verse that he writes in his letter that I feel like is especially helpful for us and has been extremely helpful for me when it comes to better understanding the issue of racial injustice. Here's what he says. He says, "My dear brothers and sisters, Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Now, James is not saying that we should never be angry. There's a time to be angry. In fact, we should be angry when we see injustice. He's also not saying that we shouldn't speak. We should speak out. Jesus spoke out. Jesus was often confrontational, and he got angry at times, angry for the right things. We call that righteous indignation. What James is saying is that our first step needs to be to listen with the intention of understanding. Now, I told you I was going to tell you some of my story, and if I'm honest with you, whenever I see a nationwide conflict, my first instinct, my reflex, is to look at it and go, okay, who's right and what side am I on? And the danger with that is that when we choose sides, there's an us and there's a them, right? It becomes less about people and more about issues. And when we do that, typically when we choose a side, my new primary objective is now proving that I'm right and the other side is wrong. And that's when we stop listening. And when we stop listening, that's when the opportunity for reconciliation starts to fade away. And so for me, like I said, my marching orders have been to listen. So I've tried to have as many conversations as possible with people from all different walks of life, all different backgrounds, all different skin colors, all different occupations and stages of life. And I have found first, like part one of my own little self-diagnosis is that I don't know. You've heard me say this before, but there is so much. I don't even know what I don't know. It started with law enforcement. I was surprised at how outraged so many law enforcement officers that I spoke to were about what happened, that they didn't see it as unfortunate but egregious, and how many of them want to see steps taken toward ensuring that racism doesn't have a place in the realm of law enforcement, so that these people who are sacrificing themselves, right, who are giving like everything they have to protect and serve, are not made to be the villains in society. However, the other thing that I saw and realized that I didn't know was the level of racism that there is in our communities, the reality of racial injustice. I heard about an experiment that happened on a university campus where there were people of all different races in this course, and they took those people and they separated them into classrooms by race. And they asked them to talk about what their race meant to them in that classroom. And the conversations were great. They were like passionate and the rooms were buzzing, except for in the room with the white people. And there was conversation for a few minutes, and then it just kind of ended and it got quiet. The reason why is because white people typically don't need to think about the fact that they're white. They have the luxury of not having to think about how their race is going to affect how they're perceived, what opportunities they have, and that is not true for a lot of people in our country, for a lot of people of color, especially in our country. You see things through a different lens when you have to think about race. Think about it like this. I heard about a person who's over 7 feet tall, and I was listening to him describe what life is like on a regular basis for him. And now for me, being that tall has always been a dream because I'm not that tall, not even close. And I love playing basketball. So, 7 feet tall is like, wow, that must be amazing. But he talked a little bit about what his life was like, about how hard it was to get a pair of shoes or a pair of pants or a shirt that fit, or if he needed a ride somewhere, how there were really only a few cars that he could actually get in, that he could fit in, how in certain places, like he's going to have to crouch to get under. There are all these obstacles that he sees that other people don't see because it's something that they don't have to think about. I was listening to a black parent, describing some conversations he's had with his kids about how he should reach for his wallet if he's ever pulled over, about when it's okay to wear a bandana and when it's not, about how to interact with law enforcement. In fact, this same parent was explaining how one time his teenage son got into a car accident And his first response, the father's first response, was fear over what would happen when law enforcement showed up. Now, nothing happened to the son. He wasn't mistreated or anything like that. But my point is that for me, that's not a thought that would ever cross my mind. Unfortunately, I've been pulled over more times than I'd like to admit, usually for speeding. And I've never wondered how I was going to be treated by law enforcement. It's just not a thought that's ever crossed my mind. I mean, yeah, I've hoped that they weren't going to give me a ticket, but it never goes beyond there. I never think, well, what's going to happen because I'm white? Do I need to be careful about how I move? And this is something that if you are not a person of color, you don't have to think about. And that was something I just did not know. These are things that were not and are not on my radar. Something else that was pointed out to me is the 4th of July. Have you ever thought about the 4th of July? The day that most of the country celebrates freedom, liberty, freedom. We're celebrating the freedom that we were given at a time when there was still slavery in this country. And for me, when I heard that thought never once crossed my mind. Never once crossed my mind. It's not to say that it's bad to celebrate the 4th of July. I'm still going to celebrate the 4th of July, but these are things that were never on my radar and won't be on my radar unless I'm continuing to have these conversations and understand how an individual's race plays a part in their daily lives. So I did not know what it was like to have to deal with racial injustice. I didn't understand the racial injustice in our communities. The other thing that I didn't understand, that I didn't know, was the extent of racism, not just out there, but in here. There have been conclusions that I have drawn, most of the time totally unaware of them, but decisions that I've made, conclusions that I've drawn about people because of the color of their skin. And that's not something I'm proud of, but it's something that was there that I didn't even know. I was talking to a black friend that I have, and we were talking about the protests, and I was asking questions. Why do you think it's looking like this and not that? And finally he said, there was like a more subtle protest that was happening. So what are you talking about? He said, well, it happened pretty recently. He said, Colin Kaepernick, the NFL quarterback that took a knee, and other NFL players as well, decided they were going to kneel during the national anthem as a way to stand up for racial injustice in our country. And when he said that, my heart, it sank. It sank. Because I can remember watching that on TV. And my first thought was, come on, we got to make this political. But it wasn't. It wasn't political. It's about racial injustice. The fact that not everybody in our country is treated the same way because of the color of their skin. And so I've been forced to ask myself, where else is this present? What other conclusions, opinions, decisions am I making, have I made because of the color of somebody's skin that I'm not even aware of? And here's where this leads. Because I don't know, or I should say when I don't know, I don't care. When we don't know how serious a problem is or that there's a problem there, we just don't engage emotionally. And that's something else I've had to deal with. Jesus tells a story. It's one of his most famous stories ever. It's the story of the Good Samaritan, right? And if you've heard that story, basically, it's a guy who gets robbed. He's left on the side of the road. He's beaten. Can't take care of himself. There are two people that walk by, totally don't even give him the time of day. They don't help him. They don't address him. One is a priest, and the other one was a Levite. Both of those people are religious people. And then there's a Samaritan, a person from a different race. To the group that Jesus was talking about, these Jewish people, they did not like Samaritans, and yet the Samaritan is the one that takes care of the person who was beaten. So there are a few themes going on there. The first theme is racism. It's an issue of race. How do we treat people who are different from us just because they're different? If you look at the way Jesus lived, he didn't leave any room for racism. Like not just for Samaritans. Like there's a scene where he went to and spoke with a Samaritan woman. That was outrageous for Jewish people at that time in that culture. And yet Jesus, he just crossed that border like it was nothing. He also helped the Romans. And if you know anything about that historical context, the Jewish people, that would not have gone over well, the idea of Jesus helping Roman soldiers or Roman centurions. They were the people that were oppressing the Jewish people, and Jesus cared for them. He helped them. He also prayed for them while he was dying. We see Jesus leaving no room for any kind of racial discrimination. He crossed borders. He broke down barriers. That was how he lived. And not just that, but if we look at the story of the Good Samaritan, following Jesus does not leave any room for a lack of compassion. We see Jesus caring for people that are like him, that are not like him, that are older than him, that are younger than him. We see him moved emotionally for people who are innocent, but also for people who are guilty. If you know the story of the woman who committed adultery, this woman was a home wrecker, and yet Jesus steps in and he shows her compassion. Right now in our country, in our world right now, we have people who are hurting. They're hurting, and whether you understand it or not, whether I understand it or not, Jesus does not leave me a window or an opportunity to not care. To follow Jesus is to live and lead with compassion, whether we completely understand things or not. And that compassion should lead us to want to know more. The Apostle Paul wrote a letter to the church in Corinth. And several times he describes the church as a body, as a body. And what he says in there is that when one part suffers, the whole body should suffer. The whole body should suffer. And there are people right now in our community, especially if you consider yourself a person of faith, who are suffering. We can't be like those indifferent, apathetic, religious people in the story of the Good Samaritan who just keep walking and look the other way. Maybe it means we take extra steps to learn about things that we don't already know about. Maybe it means we start having conversations. We're not just reading, not just posting, but calling people on the phone and asking them, what's going on? How can I better understand how you're feeling? And not just today, but 6 months from now, when there aren't protests in the street, are we still going to care? Are we still going to take steps to learn about people who are different from us? What I've found myself personally is that when I don't know, I don't care. And when I don't care, I don't act. I don't do anything about it. I don't want to learn. I don't want to call someone. It's just not on my radar, and it's easier if it's not. Jesus, if you consider yourself a follower of Jesus, he doesn't leave room for indifference or apathy when there are people around us that are hurting, that are struggling. There's a black pastor that I'm friends with that has helped me in a lot of different ways when it comes to starting this church. And I saw something that he posted. He said, "Black people, how are you feeling?" And there are dozens and dozens of responses that are heartbreaking. We have a choice. We can hurt with those who are hurting, or we can look the other way. I'll wrap up with this story. A couple days ago, I got a text message from my mom. I mentioned earlier my brother's in the Secret Service. She said, "Just so you know, your brother was arresting somebody who had a homemade bomb on them." And as soon as I heard that, I was filled with fear, honestly, with concern. It got real for me really fast. Started thinking, like, what if something happened? And instantaneously, it was like I had this realization. You could say it was God, say it was an aha moment, whatever language you'd like to give to it. But it was like, this is how it feels to fear, to be concerned for the lives of people you care about. And that's what all these protests are about. People who are concerned for the lives of people of color. in our country, people who fear for them, who want to make sure that they're not treated differently because their skin is a certain color. And so the question that I have been forced to ask myself is not, do Black lives matter? But do Black lives matter to me? Am I moved when I hear about the suffering of people around me? And if not, why? What do I need to know? What do I need to learn? What have I not yet seen? And so that's been my journey. And what I'm trying to do, and what I would ask you to do, especially if you're not a person of color, start learning. Become a student of what's going on around us. Start studying things like mass incarceration, like what we would call an implicit bias. Become a student of racism and how it affects us and affects our communities in ways that we don't even understand. The second thing I'll ask you to do is to become a student of yourself, of the decisions you've made, the conclusions that you've formed, and have the courage to be real, to not feel shame, but have the courage to be real about what's going on in here. And maybe when we start to change what's going on in here, we can start to change what's going on out there. I know this is a hard topic to talk about, but I hope that this is not a conversation that ends with this little online service. If you'd like to talk to me personally about anything that we've spoken about here this week, please don't hesitate to reach out. I appreciate you listening. I love you guys, and I hope to see you soon.